Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving deep into a movement that, well, it really reshaped the fight for equality here in America. The Chicano movement. I think we're all pretty familiar with the broader civil rights struggles, but this one digs into the specific trials and triumphs of Mexican Americans as they fought for their place in U.S. society.
And you hit the nail on the head there. They weren't just looking for, a spot at the table as it was. A lot of the time they were like building their own table, setting their own rules of the game, And that's the kind of dynamic we're going to untangle today. The wins they had, the pushback they faced, and how all of that echoes even now, all these years later.
And to help us unpack all of this, well, we've got a pretty amazing set of sources. We've got those big picture historical overviews to kind of set the scene. We've got some super insightful scholarly perspectives. But then, and this is what always gets me pumped, we've got actual primary documents straight from the movement itself. Flyers, speeches, you name it, we got it.
Oh, those primary sources, those are gold. Because even within the movement, there was a ton of back and forth about the best way to move forward. It wasn't like everyone was on the same page,
Yeah, totally. Like, take Chicanismo, for example. It wasn't just a word, right? It was a whole philosophy, almost a rallying cry for some. But you're right, it definitely ruffled some feathers along the way.
It really gets to the heart of that age-old question. Revolution or reform, how hard do you push? Where do you draw the line on compromise? But you know what? Before we get too tangled up in those internal debates, I think it's important to start with the good stuff, the wins. Because the Chicano movement, man, they racked up some serious victories, especially when it came to education.
Oh, yeah. Get ready for mind-blowing stat number one.
Mm.
They actually managed to get Chicano Studies programs established at universities all across the country. And it wasn't just about, teaching history. It was about reclaiming it, owning it. All right.
100%. Imagine the impact on students who had never seen themselves reflected in what they were learning before. It wasn't just facts and figures. It was about identity, about seeing your culture and history valued. And that is huge.
Huge is right. And it wasn't just colleges and universities either. The battle for bilingual education, that was massive. Today, we kind of take it for granted, but back then, they were going up against this deeply ingrained English-only mentality.
They were basically like, hold up, language is a way to connect, not a wall to divide us. And they saw the benefits of bilingualism for everyone, not just Spanish speakers. Talk about being ahead of their time.
Makes you think, what would our schools look like today if they hadn't fought that fight? And they didn't stop there. They pushed hard for more Chicano teachers and administrators, too. They knew that representation, seeing yourself in those roles, it matters.
Think about what it means for a kid to see someone who looks like them, talks like them, shares their background, standing at the front of the classroom. That's more than just teaching. That's empowering the next generation.
For sure. But even in education, there were some clashes, right?
Yeah.
Like the whole debate around busing. A lot of civil rights groups were all about busing as the way to desegregate schools. But a lot of Chicano activists, they weren't so keen on it.
It shows you how much they were thinking for themselves, right? They weren't just going along with whatever the mainstream approach was. They were worried about busing disrupting their communities, and they argued that the focus should be on, improving the schools their kids were already going to.
So it wasn't just about getting into any school. It was about the quality of education within their own neighborhoods.
Absolutely. It gets back to that idea of self-determination. They weren't going to just accept solutions that didn't fit their needs. And that commitment to self-determination, well, it really shows up in their political activism, too.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely shaking things up in the political arena. Enter the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, or SVREP for short. And this wasn't just about voting. This was about claiming a political power that had been denied to them for way too long.
And they were serious about it. Active in 15 states, registering voters, and especially focusing on getting recent immigrants naturalized so they could have a say in the system.
All right, get ready for mind-blowing stat number two. Think back to California's Proposition 187 back in the 90s, the one that was trying to, deny public services to undocumented immigrants. That fight was intense, and SVREP, they were right there on the front lines.
It shows you what was at stake, right? This wasn't some theoretical debate. This was about people's lives, their access to basic needs. The Chicano movement was willing to go head-to-head with some powerful forces.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
But beyond the politics, beyond those battles for better schools, there's this whole other side to the Chicano movement that I find, honestly, Really fascinating. It's that surge of cultural pride that ran through everything they did.
Yeah, that cultural revival was deliberate and it was powerful. I mean, think about the word Chicano itself. It was used as a slur, a way to put Mexican Americans down. But they took that word, flipped it on its head, and turned it into something to be proud of.
It's like they were saying, you want to define us? Nah, we'll define ourselves. Thank you very much.
Exactly. And it wasn't just talk either. You see it in the way they founded their own churches, created youth groups, launched community projects. They were building solidarity and celebrating their heritage in every corner of their lives.
It really was like a cultural awakening, not just a political movement, but like any movement. I guess it wasn't without its internal struggles, right? And that's where things get really interesting.
Because it wasn't some perfectly unified front, you know? There were tensions, disagreements about strategy, even clashes over, like, core values. And understanding those internal divisions is key to really grasping how complex this movement was.
All right, so let's unpack some of those fault lines. One of the biggest ones I keep seeing is the whole class and ideology divide. You had folks from different walks of life with very different visions for the future.
Exactly. And this is where the United Farm Workers, the UFW, comes back into the picture. Their stance on undocumented immigration, well, it created some serious friction, even within the Chicano movement itself.
That was kind of a head-scratcher at first, right? You'd think a group fighting for farm workers would be all for more laborers. But their reasoning gets to a question that still resonates today.
The UFW was worried that undocumented workers would be, more easily exploited, and that would end up hurting everyone's wages in the long run. They were afraid it would undermine all their efforts to unionize and get fair treatment for their members.
So they were trying to protect what they had already fought for. But, I mean, it also created this tension between, like, the rights of those already here and the needs of newly arrived immigrants.
It's a tough spot to be in, and it shows how complex social change really is. There can be all sorts of unintended consequences. Even within movements that share a common goal, sometimes those goals can bump up against each other.
Definitely. And then you had this other divide, the one between, like, the fiery Chicanismo ideology and those who favored a more moderate approach. And it wasn't just about tactics. It was about how you viewed the whole system.
All right, 100%. Groups like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and the GI Forum, they're more about working within the system, pushing for change bit by bit. They saw that as the most practical path to progress.
But Chicanismo, that was a different animal. It was about rejecting the whole system outright, taking a more militant stance, demanding a complete overhaul. It's crazy how those two opposing viewpoints existed side by side within the same movement.
It fueled a lot of debate, that's for sure. Should they be pushing for integration or going for separatism? Should they play by the rules or break them to get their point across? These weren't easy questions to answer, and in the end, they did lead to some fracturing within the movement.
And on top of all that internal pressure, they had external forces trying to, well, basically sabotage them.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it, any movement that challenges the way things are is going to attract some powerful enemies.
And this is where the U.S. government's reaction gets really interesting and honestly a little disturbing. We're not just talking about political opposition here. We're talking about deliberate efforts to disrupt the movement and make them look bad.
From what I've read, they used everything from spying on them to sending undercover agents to try and sow discord within their ranks. Kind of creepy when you think about it.
It definitely highlights the power dynamics at play, right? The government saw the Chicano movement as a threat, and they weren't afraid to use some shady tactics to keep them in check.
But it wasn't just the feds, right? The movement also had a tough time achieving like a true national unity because of internal rivalries and different groups having different priorities.
Exactly. There was this constant tension between what was important to specific regions and the overall goals of the movement. For example, what activists in Texas were focused on could be different from what those in California were pushing for.
So on top of everything else, they were kind of fighting a war on multiple fronts. No wonder it was so hard to stay united.
It's a classic challenge for any movement trying to make big changes, especially one as diverse and multifaceted as this one. How do you balance that need for unity with the reality that different regions, different ideologies, different strategies for change are all going to be in the mix?
It really does make their achievements all the more impressive, considering all the hurdles they had to overcome. But even with those internal divisions and all that pressure from the outside, the Chicano movement left a major mark on American society. And to really understand that impact, I think we need to look at how institutions and like philanthropic organizations reacted to its rise.
Because the reaction wasn't always what you'd expect. The fact that the Chicano movement was perceived as radical, that actually pushed some institutions and funders to look for other ways to support Latino rights.
So they were kind of sidestepping the movement itself and looking for groups that seemed less, I don't know, less confrontational.
Yeah, in a way, they were looking for organizations that could push for Latino equality without, the perceived risks of working with groups seen as more radical.
And this is where organizations like MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, enter the scene.
Exactly. MALDEF got its start in Texas in 1968, and they took a different route. They used the legal system to fight discrimination.
So instead of marches and protests, they were filing lawsuits, challenging discriminatory policies in court. Interesting strategy.
It was very strategic. They were fighting for equality within the legal framework, and they won some major victories along the way.
I'm really curious to hear more about their specific wins and how they navigated that legal landscape, but I'm guessing their approach probably appealed more to some of those institutions that were hesitant about the Chicano movement's more, shall we say, in-your-face tactics.
Absolutely. MALDEF was seen as a safer bet, a way to support the cause without the potential for controversy or backlash. And the fact that they were so successful using the courts to fight discrimination, well, that paved the way for other organizations to adopt similar strategies.
It's like they were taking the energy of the Chicano movement and channeling it into a new arena, one that the powers that be were maybe a little more comfortable with. But were their goals really any less radical?
That's a great question. It's definitely worth exploring how those legal victories actually translated into real changes for Chicano communities.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what were the trade-offs they had to make to achieve those wins through the legal system?
Yeah, good point. We'll have to unpack that more. But I think we've already covered a lot of ground in this first section. From education reform to political battles to the complexities of all those internal divisions, it's clear that this movement was about way more than just catchy slogans and protests.
It was a force to be reckoned with, always evolving, challenging barriers, both outside and within its own ranks. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating to study. It reminds us that social change is rarely neat and tidy. It's messy, it's complicated, and it often forces us to make tough choices.
Totally. But before we go any deeper into those complexities, I think it's time for a quick break.
Sounds good to me. I'm excited to dig into those primary sources and get a firsthand look at what was happening at the heart of the Chicano movement. One thing that really strikes me is how the Chicano movement had to fight on so many different levels. Like, it wasn't just about overcoming all those roadblocks from the outside world. It was also about working through these internal disagreements about strategy and goals.
It's like they were trying to build this movement while also, like, figuring out what the movement even was in the first place.
Yeah.
And, I mean, let's be real, that's bound to create some serious growing pains.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why those primary sources are such a treasure. They give us this window into those debates as they were unfolding, in real time.
Okay, so let's crack open some of those primary sources. You mentioned the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report from 1970, the one that really exposed all that systemic discrimination against Mexican Americans, especially in places like Stark County, Texas, right?
Yes, that report, it's a must read. And it's not just about, dry statistics and figures. It's filled with people's personal stories, testimonies from folks whose lives were directly impacted by all those discriminatory policies.
It's one thing to hear about discrimination in, a general sense, but it's a whole other thing to read those firsthand accounts of how it played out in people's everyday lives. It must have been like a real wake-up call for a lot of people back then.
It was, and it's a reminder that these weren't just, theoretical issues. This stuff was having a real impact on people's access to education, healthcare, housing, you name it. It was affecting everything.
It's heartbreaking, but also incredibly inspiring to see how people, even when facing all that adversity, found the strength to come together and fight back.
For sure. And those personal stories, they really come to life in the protest materials from that era. You can just feel the energy, the passion that was driving the Chicano movement just by looking at the flyers and posters they created.
I bet. Were there any recurrent themes or images that jumped out at you when you were looking at those materials?
Oh, definitely. One of the biggest ones was this whole idea of reclaiming their history and heritage. You see images of Aztec warriors, pre-Columbian symbols, and all of that is woven together with these calls for social justice and self-determination.
So it was about connecting to a past that had been, I don't know, kind of erased or distorted.
Yeah.
and using that connection to fuel their present-day struggles.
Exactly. And you also see a lot of emphasis on cultural pride. There are images of people wearing traditional clothing, celebrating their language, their music, their food. It's like a big celebration of everything that makes them Chicano.
It sounds like they weren't just demanding equality, they were defining what that equality should look like,
Yeah,
on their own terms.
that's a great way to put it. And that spirit of self-definition, you really see it come through in the writings of someone like Cesar Chavez. He wasn't just a labor leader, he was also this philosopher, visionary. He laid out this whole worldview that was rooted in the Chicano identity and experience.
Okay, so let's talk about Chavez. He's such an iconic figure, but his writings, they give you a glimpse beyond that, that public image. What did you find most striking about his perspective?
What's interesting about Chavez is that he was wrestling with these really complex issues like labor rights, immigration, social justice. And his writings, they show us those internal tensions and debates that were happening within the Chicano movement. Remember, the United Farm Workers stance on undocumented immigration was controversial, even among Chicanos themselves.
Right, they were trying to protect the rights of those who were already union members. But that stance, well, it created friction with some who saw it as like a betrayal of the broader community. It must have been a really tough situation to navigate.
It was, and Chavez, he doesn't shy away from that complexity in his writing. He's really thoughtful and reflective, and he acknowledges that sometimes, you have to make tough choices.
It's a reminder that even in movements that share the same big goals, there are going to be disagreements, differences in how to get things done. It's about finding a way to work through those differences without losing sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And I think Chavez's writings really highlight the intellectual depth and the moral seriousness of the Chicano movement. They weren't just reacting to injustice, they were thinking deeply about the kind of world they wanted to build.
So it wasn't just about tearing down the old system, but about creating something new in its place. Like they had to come up with a blueprint for the future they were fighting for.
Yeah, that's a great point. They were envisioning a world where being Chicano was something to celebrate, where their contributions were recognized, and when they had a real say in shaping their own destinies.
It's a vision that feels really relevant today, as we're still grappling with issues like inequality and social justice. But shifting gears a bit, I'm curious to hear more about the different ways scholars have interpreted the Chicano movement. You mentioned there are these main schools of thought: the progressive school, the social history school, the revisionist school, and the post-colonial school.
Right. Each of these schools offers a different lens through which to view the movement, highlighting different aspects of its origins, its impact, and its legacy.
Let's start with the progressive school. What's their take?
So the progressive school, historians like Harry McWilliams, they really focus on the systemic inequalities that Mexican Americans faced in the United States. They see the Chicano movement as a direct response to centuries of discrimination, exploitation, and being pushed to the margins of society.
So they're placing the movement within this broader historical context, emphasizing that long struggle for equality.
Exactly. For them, the Chicano movement is part of this larger story of progress, a story about the ongoing fight to expand rights and opportunities for everyone.
It's a hopeful narrative, but it also acknowledges, how deep-rooted those problems were that the movement was up against.
It does. And then you have the social history school, which takes a different approach. They're less interested in the big picture and more focused on the everyday lives of the people who made the movement happen, the folks on the ground.
So they're looking at it from the bottom up, focusing on that grassroots activism that fueled it.
Exactly. Historians like Vicky Ruiz, she's a key figure in this school. They emphasize the role of community organizing, cultural expression, and the creation of alternative institutions in shaping the Chicano movement.
It's a reminder that movements are made up of individuals, each with our own stories and motivations. It's about the people who showed up, who marched, who organized, who put their lives on the line for a cause they believed in.
Absolutely. And then you have the revisionist school. They take a more, shall we say, critical look at the movement.
Okay, I'm always interested in hearing the critiques. What are the revisionists' main arguments?
So historians like Matt Garcia, he's a leading voice in this school. They argue that the Chicano movement, while undeniably important, was also held back by its internal divisions, its rhetoric that sometimes excluded people, and its struggles to connect with other social movements happening at the same time.
So they're acknowledging the movement's achievements, but also pointing out where it fell short.
Right. They're offering a more nuanced and maybe a more balanced assessment of the movement's strengths and weaknesses.
I think it's important to have that critical perspective to avoid, like, romanticizing the past.
Correct.
Every movement has its blind spots, and it's by being honest about that that we can really learn from both the successes and the failures of those who came before us.
I couldn't agree more. And finally, you have the post-colonial school. They place the Chicano movement within this global context.
Okay, so we're zooming out, looking at the bigger picture now.
Exactly. Scholars like Juan Gonzalez, a prominent figure in this school, they argue that you can't fully understand the Chicano movement without considering the legacy of colonialism, the history of U.S. intervention in Latin America, and the ongoing struggles for self-determination in that region.
So they're seeing it as part of this much larger story, like a transnational fight against imperialism and oppression.
Precisely. For them, the Chicano movement is part of a global fight for justice and equality, one that goes beyond national borders.
It's a powerful perspective.
Yeah.
And it highlights how interconnected those struggles for social justice are around the world. It makes you realize that these fights for equality aren't isolated. They're all part of this bigger picture.
They are. And by understanding those connections, we can get a much deeper appreciation for the complexity and the significance of the Chicano movement.
So we've got these 4 different schools of thought, each with their own way of looking at the movement. But what about the legacy? How do these historians view the lasting impact of the Chicano movement?
Well, even with their different approaches, most historians agree that the Chicano movement had a profound and lasting impact on American society. They point to, the progress made in education, the increase in political participation, the cultural revival, and just a greater awareness of Chicano identity and issues. All of that is evidence of the movement's enduring legacy.
It's really amazing to think about how much has changed as a result of their efforts. They really did shift the landscape in so many ways.
They did. And even though the movement itself may have, faded over time, its spirit lives on in all the people and organizations that are still out there fighting for social justice and equality.
So the fight goes on, inspired by what they started. But before we wrap up our deep dive, I want to go back to those primary sources for just a sec. We talk about the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report and the protest materials, but what about Cesar Chavez's writings? What specific insights did you find in his perspective?
Chavez's writings, they really are a treasure trove of insights into how the Chicano movement worked from the inside. One of the things that really stood out to me was his unwavering commitment to nonviolence. He truly believed that real change, lasting change, could only come through peaceful means, even when faced with incredible brutality and oppression.
That's a powerful message, especially during that time when there was so much violence happening. It speaks volumes about the moral compass of the movement and their dedication to building a better world through love and compassion.
Absolutely. And Chavez's writings also show his deep understanding of the importance of unity and solidarity. He constantly talked about the need for people from all walks of life to come together and fight for a shared cause.
It's a message that feels like really relevant today. We're facing so many challenges that require us to act collectively. It's a reminder that we're stronger together and that by joining forces, we could overcome even the biggest obstacles. That makes you wonder, though, what if the movement had been able to bridge some of those internal divides? What if they could have presented a more unified front? How different would things be?
That's a really interesting question to think about. Maybe they could have achieved even more. Or maybe those internal debates were part of what made the movement so dynamic and ultimately so influential.
It's fascinating to consider. But one thing's for sure, even with those internal struggles, their legacy is undeniable. They won significant victories in education, politics, and cultural awareness, and they inspired generations of activists to keep fighting for social justice.
Absolutely. Their story shows us that even when faced with enormous challenges, progress is possible. And every act of courage, every voice raised against injustice, it all contributes to bending that arc of history towards a more just and equitable world.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
It's been a pleasure sharing this deep dive with you.
And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the Chicano movement as much as we have. We encourage you to keep digging deeper, keep asking questions, and keep that spirit of activism alive in your own lives. Because, as the Chicano movement shows us, change doesn't happen overnight. But with persistence, with compassion, and a belief in a better future, we can move mountains. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. It really is inspiring their commitment to a better future. It makes you think about all the challenges they faced and how they shifted gears, changed tactics to keep pushing for change. Like we were talking about before with MALDEF and how they moved from street protests to the courtroom. It was about using the legal system itself to fight those discriminatory policies.
It's a great example of how movements have to adapt, right? It wasn't about giving up on their goals. It was about recognizing that sometimes you need to find a different battlefield to win the war.
Exactly. It wasn't just about persuading people. It was about winning concrete legal battles that would actually change people's lives.
And MALDEF's approach, it was definitely effective. They challenged discriminatory practices in education, in employment, in voting rights. I mean, they really laid the groundwork for greater equality under the law.
Makes you wonder if that shift to a more legal strategy, if that was partly because of the pushback they were getting from the government, all that surveillance and infiltration stuff we talked about.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely possible that all that pressure forced them to rethink their tactics, find new ways to move forward. It shows how movements have to constantly evolve to survive.
And it wasn't just MALDEF either. We also talked about the National Council of La Raza, now Unida, right?
Yeah.
They had this broader approach, tackling things like economic empowerment and social justice, along with political advocacy.
They were focused on creating lasting change by going after those root causes of inequality. And they knew that real progress meant working on multiple fronts.
So they were making those connections between issues like poverty and education, healthcare, political representation, understanding that it's all connected.
Exactly. They were pushing for this more holistic approach to social change, one that took into account the systemic factors that keep inequality going.
It's a strategy that's still so relevant today, right?
Yeah.
You can't just treat the symptoms. You got to address the underlying issues to create real, lasting change. But you know what? I want to circle back to those primary sources for a minute. We talked about those powerful personal stories in the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report and how those protest materials really captured the energy and passion of the movement. But what about Chavez's writings? What really resonated with you?
I think what struck me most about Chavez's writing was his unwavering belief in nonviolence. I mean, he faced some brutal stuff, real oppression, but he never gave up on those peaceful methods. It says a lot about his character, but also his understanding of how powerful love and compassion can be.
It's such a relevant message, even today, In a world that feels so divided and angry sometimes, his message of nonviolence, it's a powerful reminder that there's another way, a way that can lead to healing, to coming together.
And it wasn't just about these lofty ideals either. He gave very practical advice on how to organize, how to build solidarity, how to resist injustice without resorting to violence.
It's like he laid out a blueprint for effective ethical activism. And his emphasis on unity, on collective action, that's something we can all learn from, no matter what cause we're fighting for.
Definitely. He knew that real lasting change comes from building bridges, finding common ground, recognizing our shared humanity even when we disagree.
It makes you think about those divisions within the Chicano movement itself and how, in the end, they probably held the movement back. Imagine if they'd been able to overcome those differences, present a truly united front. Who knows what they could have achieved?
It's a question historians are still debating today. But even with those internal struggles, their impact is undeniable. They won major victories in education, politics, cultural awareness, and they inspired so many others to keep fighting for social justice.
Their story is a reminder that even when things seem impossible, progress can happen. And that every act of courage, every voice that speaks out against injustice, it all plays a part in pushing us towards a more just and equitable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
I agree. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It's been an incredible journey exploring this really crucial chapter in American history.
The pleasure was all mine, truly.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Chicano movement as much as we did. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep that spirit of activism alive in your own lives. Because as the Chicano movement so powerfully reminds us, change doesn't happen overnight. But with persistence, with compassion, and a belief in the possibility of a better future, well, we can move mountains. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.